Yay.
All right. All right. And I forgot it doesn't tell you on StreamYard when people are watching.
I know.
You'd think I would like remember these things after we've done how many of these now across different projects, but
yeah.
Let's see.
What it is.
Okay, yeah, it's showing live, so that's always a good start.
Yes.
And it should
Okay.
be running on the YouTube channel.
Yes,
so.
I see it too. I was just
Yes.
checking.
Good.
Perfect.
Okay.
I'll just.
I was telling Kara, you can tell when I got desperate and switched to the audiobook. I try.
I am impressed that I made it farther than you physically. So, ooh,
I was lucky. It's just that I realized I had 2 days left.
Exactly. That's why I switched. I was like, oh, I have to read half this book all today. I guess we're listening at 2.5 times speed. Okay. Kara, did you read it physically?
I did. I am proud of myself. And actually, part of the reason is because I listened to samples of the audio ones I had access to, and I didn't really like any of them. And I also I don't think I would have been able to listen to it very quickly because of the particular accents that they were using.
Sure.
Because I don't know, I can listen to American accents much faster, probably because that's what I'm used to hearing. And I was like, I don't know if an audiobook would keep me properly motivated. So yeah, I ended up sticking with the physical copy. Yeah, which worked out. I finished much more quickly than I had planned for because I hit a point where I'm like, I'm going to power through. I'm just going to make it happen today.
Respect.
Okay. Yeah, so we're showing a few people already watching, which is great. I figure we'll give it maybe a couple more minutes, and then we'll kind of start easing into the discussion.
I did want to show off this edition I have with an introduction by Gail Forman, and look at the tree. I am in love with it.
Oh,
ooh!
That it was the actual tree until you pointed it out. I love that.
Yeah,
I love that.
In love with it. It matches my Wuthering Heights one.
Ooh, what editions are these? Oh, I've seen that one of Wuthering Heights. I haven't seen that edition of Jane Eyre though before.
Yeah, the Wuthering Heights has the introduction by S.E. Hinton, which did not age well.
Oops, yeah.
And
neither did Wuthering Heights, let's be honest.
Yeah. Jane Eyre. That is something I would like to bring up, is a sort of racial aspect of it.
Yes, that's one of the things I have down to talk about in connection to Bertha, I imagine, is what. Yep. Yeah, I know, and the weird code words they use for it because they don't actually Yeah. Definitely going to be one of the themes or topics we cover.
Sorry, I should have mentioned that before we went live, but I was it came to me.
No, it's good to know.
That's fine. Okay. So my computer is still being a little laggy, but since the audio seems to be working okay, I figure we just jump in. Okay, and YouTube is showing that we have several people tuning in already, which is great. Let me just double check that. Okay.
Oh. I'm going to keep snacking.
Go for it.
I literally haven't had dinner. Well, it's 5 for me here. Because I barely ate today because I was focused on reading.
Oh no!
It's fine. Some Pringles down my throat right before the live show.
Snacking is encouraged.
Great. That's why I forewent the earbuds, because I figured that would be a little too ASMR to have the crunching right there in the microphone. We don't need that.
Special edition of the discussion.
Here's what I think about.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kara. My channel is Wild Book Garden, which you obviously know if you are watching this. And just a quick, technical note. For some reason, my computer is lagging a little bit, but the audio seems to be okay. So this shouldn't interfere too much with our discussion, but I might be asking or responding to questions a little slower so that I can actually, see what people are doing. And then the other quick thing before we get started is I went ahead and I linked a few resources on voting in the United States in the description box. You still have time, depending on your county and state rules, to early vote or to make a plan to vote safely in person. If you have a mail-in ballot, you can drop those off in the designated receptacles. You should have gotten a list from your county that identified the official ones. Remember that any other box is not guaranteed to get your ballot to where it needs to go to be counted. I'm sure everybody is sick of hearing about voting, but please do check that out if you haven't yet made a plan to vote. Okay, and let's go ahead and get started with our discussion of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. We're going to start out kind of how we normally do with a general introduction. So I'm going to ask my guests Taylor from Page Screen Taylor and Julia from Shakespeare and Such, who are both lovely people, linked below. Please follow them. We're going to start out with kind of our previous experience with this story, if we have any, and our overall thoughts on the book reading it this time around. So Taylor or Julia, go ahead and start.
Would you like to go, Julia?
Sure. So I actually watched the movie of Jane Eyre before I ever read it. I saw I think it's the 2011 version. But it was a couple of years after it came out. And then 2 years ago in 2018, I read Jane Eyre for Victober, and I read it as an audiobook, and I gave it 3.5 stars. So I was very excited to reread it because although it wasn't my favorite book ever, Jane is a character who has stuck with me so much. And actually one of just my favorite books, period, is a Jane Eyre retelling. So if you haven't read Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay, I highly encourage it. But yeah, should I say how I feel now having reread it, or wait?
Yeah, no, go ahead and give kind of your overall thoughts. We're obviously going to get very detailed and specific, but just kind of your general experience and impressions this time.
I am now at a full solid 4 stars for the book, and Jane Eyre, the character, continues to get 10 out of 5 stars. She's at 200%. Yeah. I love her.
Yes.
So I have mentioned this book before. The first time I read it was, I want to say I was in 8th grade. This book kind of helped gently guide me out of my Twilight phase. This kind of puts it sensibility. And I loved it then. I just fell in love with the atmosphere and the sort of ongoing mystery. I loved Jane Eyre as a character. Mr. Rochester is hilarious. I know he's not meant to be, but he's so funny. And so I probably would have given it 5 out of 5 stars then if I had a rating system, which I didn't. And since 8th grade, so let's just say 10 years, I have reread it maybe 3 other times. So this is probably my 5th time reading this book. I adore it. I love it so much. Yeah, that's all I can say. I love this book. Still 5 out of 5 stars. It holds up for me.
Okay. So we kind of knew this might happen when we were planning who was going to host which live show. Because I had never actually finished Jane Eyre. I think when I was around 12 years old, is when I randomly checked it out from my public library. And I was like, this is a famous book. I want to read it. And I got about halfway through it and I DNF'd it. It's actually one of the only classics that I ever just like abandoned reading in the middle. I remember that one of the reasons I quit reading it was Rochester. I like just could not with him. I remember like very few other impressions about the first time I read that book, except that I was like, we were getting into the like a lot of Rochester scenes, and I'm like, I'm out. Like I just can't put up with him. So this was my first time actually finishing the book, and I 100% agree with Jane as like a 10 out of 10 character. I adore her. I think she deserves so much better than Rochester, but we will get into that. The book overall, I did not really enjoy. Jane was kind of one of the saving graces about the book for me, because I find her such an interesting character and a really interesting mix of contradictions in her character. And I did like some of the themes that this book deals with, which we also will get into. Some of them are handled a little inconsistently, but I thought this book had really interesting things to say about class and beauty and goodness. Like I said, I enjoyed Jane. Didn't really like everything else, which is kind of why I didn't enjoy the book very much. Wasn't a big fan of the writing or the story itself or Mr. Rochester, which he kind of, I feel like there are certain parts of the book where he kind of like dominates the story. So that was kind of rough. Are we sharing star ratings? Is that something I should do?
Go for it.
I gave my star rating.
Yeah, I gave it 2 stars. And it was like it squeaked through at 2 stars because I adore Jane with all my heart. So in a way, it's impressive that I liked her as much as I did, because she was surrounded by a story that I did not love. So anyway, yeah, that's my experience with Jane Eyre, but I did finish it this time, which I'm pretty proud of. So we've kind of talked about our overall experience, and we all kind of ended up talking about Jane a little bit, because I think she's such a dynamic and interesting character. And this novel was pretty, I mean, from what I've read, it was pretty revolutionary for Charlotte Bronte to tell this kind of first-person story like this, and to have such a strong voice for her main character. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more in detail about our thoughts on Jane as a character and why we liked her, because we all agree that we really loved her as a protagonist. So let's, Taylor, do you want to start this time?
Okay. So I think
Sorry.
the beginnings of Jane's story is like nothing new to literature, you know, orphan, mistreated, and then they come into adventure and fortune and whatnot. But I think what's really interesting is that everything is directly from the perspective of Jane. It's not even just first person. She's addressing the reader constantly, which is something I had forgotten how often she addresses us. And I think what's really interesting is that she always has, I'm kind of like plagiarizing my English teacher from 12th grade on this one, but you know, her whole versus passion dilemma going on, always struggling between what is the reasonable thing to do and what is the passionate thing to do. And I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to as well. Like, this is what makes logical sense, but I really, really want to do this. I really, really want to be with this man with an attic wife, you know. And I also,
as you do.
Exactly. But I also felt like a lot of her decisions, for the most part, made sense for her as a character and where she was at the time of the book. Near the end, maybe not as much, but you know what? For the most part. So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's hard for me to talk about Jane because I've said this before and I still feel this way, having it so fresh in my mind, that I think she is like the character in all the literature that I've read that I think I relate most to. So it just sounds like cocky when I say nice things about her, because it sounds like I'm like, oh, and I feel that way too. But I just love everything about her. Like, I don't even know where to start. Like, I think that kind of what you were saying, Taylor, about like the passionate side, I think her personality is so interesting and how it can vary depending on who she's talking to or how they're talking to her. Like she says later when she's in the cottage with her cousins, that she's like, oh, it was so much easier to tell him no when he was being rude to me, because like if someone's condescending, I can give it right back to them, but if someone's being nice, it's hard to say no. And I just love all that duality because it makes her so human, because that's a very real feeling. Like it's easy to be sassy back to someone who's already being rude, but it's a lot harder to be like no and stand your ground if someone's like, please.
Yeah.
I agree with the things that I loved most about Jane and that I found most interesting was the mix she has of like intense practicality and then also this really strong streak of romanticism. I really like that. I think it made her a very dynamic character, and I also just really admired her like as a person. I really admired the strength of her convictions and the fact that even though she did struggle with what she wanted in the moment versus what she knew was right, and that she knew doing what was right would make her happier with herself long term, even if she was unhappy about the opportunities she was giving up. I just really admired her ability to stay true to what she believed. But I also, from a like relatability perspective, like we were saying, I liked that she didn't always find it easy to make the right decision or to even sometimes know what that was. Like I think that was very, very human and made her like a very interesting character to the reader. I think in a weird way, the fact that I liked Jane so much is part of what made the story hard for me to read sometimes, because the first chunk of this book is just like, I think, pretty miserable. She has a horrible childhood. She is abused and neglected. She goes to a school where she is abused and neglected. She loses the only friend that she cared about. And then even throughout the book, there's like these really intense periods of just Jane being unhappy or trying to even find somewhere where like people will treat her like another person. And I think the fact that I love Jane so much is part of what made that really hard, because like I was just reading like a series of awful things happening to the only character I cared about in this book, which I think is a testament to how well written she is as a character, that like it was like really like painful and unpleasant to read about how unhappy she was for like 100+ pages.
Yeah. I will agree that the beginning is pretty rough.
It's bleak.
I love the beginning.
I love the beginning too. I think what it does a really good job of is laying the foundation for older Jane. So like a lot of her decisions based off of her backstory make sense.
Yeah.
I think. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Julia.
I'm not going to forget. Go ahead.
Okay. I also I think this is one of the best examples I've read of a character who you see age up throughout the story, who still feels consistent to who they were at the beginning while also feeling like they changed enough to feel like a real person. I really liked that. Like I didn't enjoy the beginning of the book, I think, and I think it could have been shortened a little bit. But I do really appreciate the way that Charlotte Bronte laid that groundwork for seeing how you can make connections between her experiences and decisions as a child with who she is as a person later, and also seeing how she kind of grew into herself a little bit more. I think that was really, really well balanced.
Yeah.
I 100% agree. I think not only does it lay the foundation of like who she is as a character and what her personality is like, but it does grow, like she grows as a character in a very believable way, where it's like she doesn't lose her stubborn streak, but she like learns to be a little more tactful and like stand her ground in just like a very calm way and be like, actually, I'm not marrying you. I have to leave. Goodbye. Like all that. what I was going to say before was I noticed, not for Jane Eyre specifically, but in just book reviews in general, a lot of people don't seem to like stories where like the character starts as a child and then they grow to be whatever, a teenager, an adult. But I feel like Jane Eyre is one of those books that does it so well that it's the reason why I love books that do that. Like anytime a book shows me a character like from their childhood, I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to see where it all began. Like that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also
Oh,
sorry, go ahead, Kara.
Sorry. This is the problem with the lagging computer is I can't always I was just going to say that I tend not to like those either, but I feel like Jane Eyre did it really well. So go ahead, Taylor.
I was just going to say it does also present that whole reason versus passion theme that my 12th grade English teacher, Mrs. Brown, told us about that I am repurposing for this live show. But she's so passionate as a child, and like I don't blame her. If my cousin threw a book at my head, I'd also be just a little bit upset about that.
Yeah.
But, her cousin was a monster.
God, he's awful. But just seeing how passionate she was back then, even like at the school when Helen Burns, I think she was like whipped or something. I don't know what they called it back then. It wasn't a full whipping, but they had like a switch or something.
Yeah.
And
it was a little whipping for children.
a little whipping. Jane said that she would have taken it and like beaten the teacher with it, which also that's fair, but passion and not really understanding like maybe it's more tactful to do something this way, or maybe just avoid the punishment altogether. Not a great lesson, but I get for 1800s England that was the way to go.
But if you don't like that character growth, I'm going to keep plugging it all night, and you would like to see a Jane who takes revenge on all the people who do her wrong, read Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay. Over you guys.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can show the comments on the screen because my computer is still lagging. If not, I'll just have to read them. But Jess said, I don't think the book would be nearly as enjoyable if her backstory wasn't explored as deeply as it was. And 100%. I do think that the background, I think it really helps you know Jane very early on. Like from pretty early in the book, I felt like I really understood her as a character and where she was coming from. So I do think that introductory portion was very important for setup. Like I said, I think it was a little long, but I do 100% agree that it was like a really important section of the book. Okay, let me see if it's going to let us. Sorry, computer, still being slow. Okay, so while my computer thinks about doing what I tell it to, let's move into some of the like Gothic story elements of this book. And specifically, I wanted to ask you guys how you feel about how this novel as a whole fits into the Gothic novel tradition versus Jane as a character. Do you think Jane is a Gothic feeling heroine? So yeah, thoughts on that?
That's a good question.
It is.
I think as far as the Gothic novel goes, it really only fits the Gothic genre, I feel like, in the middle and kind of near the end. So, in the middle, you've got Thornfield Hall, there's a mystery, there are fires and so on, and then it's revealed what the monster is. And then at the end, you have that sort of, like, supernatural, ghostly, like, calling to each other with Jane and Rochester. But other than that, like, the very beginning and the part when she's just hanging out with St. John and her cousins, like, it doesn't feel very Gothic at all. I would probably still consider it a Gothic novel, though, just because the middle part is so Gothic. The Red Room. That's
the Red Room is spooky.
Yeah, it is. That scene is also really well done. As far as Jane as a Gothic heroine, she's a little too clued in. But I do like seeing her trying to solve the mystery of the fires and totally side-eyeing Grace Poole the entire time.
The whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel very like not widely read in the Gothic genre. Like I know we read Wuthering Heights, but like other than the Brontes, I struggle to think. Well, I guess I just read Rebecca.
Rebecca, yeah.
Very good.
I feel like I don't know what I've read that's Gothic. So to me, yeah, it's just kind of like those little bit of like bits and pieces and tropes that I know about of like, ooh, mysterious house, like you fall in love with someone. What kind of secrets are they keeping from you? Probably really dark ones. So I do think it's pretty true to the genre in those aspects. But Taylor, I do agree with what you said. Like there are some parts of the story that feel less Gothic. Like that whole like last third could almost be like Test the D'Urbervilles or something. Like it just kind of feels like a different sort of story. I don't know. You're going to find out the more I talk about this book that the biggest issue I have with it is the pacing. I think the pacing is atrocious.
Yeah. And like I don't care about pacing at all. Like it almost never factors into what I think of a book. And this book, I'm like, what was your move here? Like it feels very choppy in some places, but just like incredibly slow overall. Also like my edition was like a very weird, like very small but like little ant track sized print, so like it felt like I was never making progress, which might be part of it. It's like a very old used edition that I read, so maybe that was part of it. But yeah, as far as the Gothic elements, I agree with what you guys have been saying, and I'm not gonna try and like click the comment because that just overwhelmed my computer. But Novellytic said, Jane also isn't the stereotypical damsel in distress often seen in Gothic lit. It is refreshing, especially from a classic.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much how I feel about it, is the setting of Thornfield Hall specifically, and the romance and like some of the atmosphere elements, those all feel very quintessentially Gothic to me, although I also am not like an expert in the genre. I've read some Du Maurier, I've read obviously the Brontes and like a couple other things here and there, but not an expert by any means. But yeah, so like those elements feel very like classic Gothic, but Jane as a character to me feels like very different from the like typical Gothic heroine, because she's very, like Taylor, like you said, she's a little too clued in, I think, to be a classic like Gothic damsel. And especially in some of the scenes that are very Gothic feeling, like the Red Room, I think she kind of, well, she was also a child, but she reacts to that in a much more like, oh, like the Gothic, like mystery kind of way. Whereas with all the nonsense with Rochester's wife in the attic, she's very like, I think how an actual person would respond, where she's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like her reactions to that and her choices, where she's like, no, you're going to explain this to me right now. Rather than like running away without asking any questions, or just fainting, for example. Yeah, she seems like Jane as a character, and her behavior seems to me much more like an actual person versus a kind of like Gothic female character stereotype. So yes, I agree with you guys there as well.
And I love how he refuses for it to be anything supernatural. Anytime someone tries to explain it away to her, she's like, no, I saw that, I was there, I was lucid, like, tell me who that was, because I saw a person in that room.
Yeah.
And she really stands her ground with that.
Yeah. The only time I felt like she didn't really do that, this part like made me laugh. I'm not sure if it was supposed to, but there's like the two servants who are right in front of her, and they're like whispering to each other, and they're like, does she know? And Jane's just like watching this whole conversation, and the other servant is like, I don't think so. And they're like, oh, okay. And they just like leave, and Jane just kind of stands there like, That was weird.
Honestly,
does not investigate.
this book feels like a Victorian episode of The Office, and Jane is like the gym stand-in, just always looking into the camera. Like, did you notice that?
Yeah. Jess just commented, she's like a real person dropped into an insane gothic drama. That is exactly what this feels like. Jane is like a normal person, and everyone else is like losing it.
Yeah.
Very romantic, but she like stifles it well. She's like, well, if he's not interested in me, I'm just going to pine forever by myself without him knowing. Like, that's a very real thing, I feel like.
That's how I feel like that.
Yeah, honestly, relatable.
We're going to take the feeling and we're going to bury it.
Yes. Okay, so if we don't have any more thoughts about, like, I'm sure we'll end up talking about the Gothic stuff a lot with other questions because it's very prevalent in some parts of the novel. But let's talk about Rochester and the romance overall. I have some thoughts, but we'll start with Julia and Taylor. Yeah. What do you think about him?
I'm of two minds because pragmatically, and I'm not even mad about like the bigamy aspect. I'm just like, hey, you wanted to marry her and you were lying to her this whole time? Don't be a liar. Like, that's the part that bothers me out of everything. But early in their relationship, the pining is so good. When she's like leaving the party with all the people, and he's like, "Good night, and cuts himself off. I want to set myself on fire. I love that so much. Like, if anyone ever like cut themselves off from calling me a term of endearment, I'd be like, "Oh, we're engaged now. Oh my god!" Like, I love that. But yeah, I would not marry a Rochester, but I don't know. It's Jane to me is like Helena from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Like, I think you deserve better, but this is what you want, so I want you to be happy. So, like, okay, yeah, I don't know. Taylor, I'm sure you got a lot of feelings. Hit us with them.
I love Rochester in that I hate him so much. He's a clown of the highest degree. This man has no chill. And honestly, a lot of his lines are funny. So I agree with you about the pining aspect. If it was a man that wasn't Rochester saying a lot of the lines and doing that, like, good night, I'd be swooning. But one, the fact that he's old enough to be your dad, and even people in Victorian Jane Eyre are pointing it out, saying it's a little weird.
Which also happened in Rebecca. And I'm like, why do every 2 books that I have to read for my book clubs every month, like, align now? It's freaking me out, you guys.
And like the fact that after the whole attic wife debacle that happened on her wedding day, like, I think it's like that's probably the worst part. They were about to commit, and he like, Jane's like, so I'm not going to be with you anymore, and he's like, wait, you're not? Why not?
Wow.
He's like, sorry, wait, this was a deal breaker?
Yes. Man.
That gets me. It's like afterwards, like, Jane's freaking out, and Rochester's coming in to, I guess, explain and console her, and he tries to kiss her, and she like sort of like moves out of the way or something, and he essentially is like, "Is it the attic wife?" Like, well, yes, yes, it is.
Yeah,
what a clown.
Yeah.
He's a disaster.
Don't even get me started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rochester. I hate him with the fire of 1,000 suns. Like 90% of my least favorite scenes were scenes that he was in. Honestly, like, okay, my favorite parts of this book were every time Jane said something mean to him, and the part where she's just like chilling with her cousins, having the best time of her life. Like, those were the 2 highlights of this book for me. Yeah, I like, as a gothic hero, Rochester is a great character because he just sucks. But I just like hated every scene he was in. Like even his and Jane's like conversations where it's, I don't know, kind of like flirting. He's trying. I like didn't even like those because he was just like so condescending to her every time they interacted. He like downplayed all of her achievements. He did the like not like other girls thing, but then took it back, which is like somehow even more offensive. He's like, actually, you're just like the rest of them. I was wrong. I just like don't like him as a person. He treats everybody really badly. I got real sick of him bitching about having to take care of the offspring of his mistress. Or I'm like, buddy, there are consequences to your actions, and you can just suck it up and deal with the fact that you saved an orphan like from starving. And yeah, like I also like fundamentally do not understand what Jane sees in him. Like I kept waiting for the part where we would see her fall in love with him, and I honestly thought I had forgotten a chapter or something, because like we're kind of like thrown back into the action, and the way Jane is narrating, she's like, so as you know, I'm in love with him, and I'm like, what? Like when did this happen? I don't feel like he's a very well developed character. Like 2/3 of the way through the book, we get a reference to the fact that he likes walking in the garden after dark, and that, unless I'm like misremembering, I think that was like literally the first time we got a personality trait for him besides singing that like wasn't connected to him being a douchebag like at all times. I don't like that he pretended to want to marry Blanche Ingram for like most of the book because he wanted, I don't know if he was like trying to hurt Jane or he wanted her to like speak up. And I'm like, you employ her. She's not going to do that. And you know her. She would not do that. Yeah. Also, like, it really grossed me out that up until the end of the book, she was calling him master and sir. Like, even when they were making out, I was like, thanks, I hate it. So, anyway, I'm sorry for just like, this was not structured at all. This was just me listing all of the reasons I hate Rochester.
I love it.
You did not bring up the fortune telling scene, which is my favorite scene.
Oh my god!
You got the racism.
Please go for it, Taylor.
Like, first of all, I think everyone is in agreement that it's racist. That we know that. But on top of that, he does it to ask Jane if she likes him.
Mm-hmm.
Why? He's the whole circus.
Mm-hmm.
And he like gets like stuck. He's like, Jane, it's stuck. And she's like, break it.
He has the emotional maturity of like a 9-year-old. Like,
it would have been much more charming if he did the "Do you like me?" check, yes or no.
I was just going to say that, Taylor.
Literally the Victorian equivalent.
This man is a disaster. Like, and Taylor and I were talking a little bit before Julia had joined and before we went live. I hadn't decided like how many comparisons we were going to talk about, because like on the one hand, this novel should stand on its own. Like, I don't think it's always fair to be like, oh, well, just because they're written by sisters, we have to talk about Jane Eyre versus Wuthering Heights. But something that did come to my mind when I was reading in comparison to Wuthering Heights is like, we all talked about last time how Heathcliff and Catherine have like the most effed up romance like ever, basically. But the one, for me at least, the one in Jane Eyre actually made me angrier because Catherine and Heathcliff are both trash cans. So I'm kind of like, it doesn't bother me to see you together. And I think like arguably even the other characters in the book acknowledge that it was messed up. Whereas in Jane Eyre, I feel like we're really supposed to buy into this romance. And I just love Jane so much. And I'm like, you could do so much better than this man. Like, why don't you want better for yourself, Jane? So yeah, I have like, I take it more personally in this book because I love Jane.
I have to say, this is more, again, about Jane, but it involves Rochester. I love so much. Literally, one of the best moments of this book is that she refuses to call him handsome. To his face, she says, "You are ugly. You are my boss and you are ugly." Later, when she loves him, she's like, "That's that ugly man that I love." Like, I love it so much.
I really love that.
Ugly man that I love.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I just love her. Imagine like walking up to your boss and then being like, "Hey, am I like attractive?" And you're like, "No." Couldn't be me.
Yeah. It's even funnier because after they're like engaged, Rochester starts telling her like how pretty she is and like, "Oh, you're my like beautiful fairy princess" and everything, and she's like, "You're still ugly in the face." Like,
Tell him too. She's like, "Don't tell me that." Like, she's like, "I know I'm plain. Let me be plain. Like, it's fine. We'll just
yeah,
be
she's like, "Calm down."
That is something I do enjoy about this book. You know how like when you watch a lot of comedies nowadays, it's like the guy who's like kind of nerdy looking and then this like supermodel as the love interest. They're both Jane and Rochester, I feel like, are around equal playing fields here.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's probably the one thing they're equals in.
Yeah. Yeah, I really liked that too. Actually, that's we're gonna skip around a little bit, but that's okay because we're kind of talking about this anyway. So how do we feel about the theme or like the, I guess, motif, if I wanted to use a fancy English paper word, of beauty and like inner beauty versus outer beauty and how beauty kind of plays into like virtue, this very like Victorian idea of like, if you're beautiful, you're a good person. If you're ugly, you are bad and therefore punished by God to match what a bad person you are. So yeah, just if we had like any thoughts on that.
I mean, I do like that Jane Eyre isn't this great beauty or even this like hidden beauty. She's like not pretty, so I feel like she's not pretty and she's also very, very tiny. So it's very easy to underestimate her. But I think that also allows for, obviously we can't see her, but like it also allows for the other characters to like get to know her based off of her merits, which is that she's incredibly smart and a really good person. And like
Yeah.
I think I love that the book focuses on those aspects of Jane's personality as opposed to how she looks like or how other people like how attractive other people find her.
Yeah. I agree. Sorry, Julia, do you want to go before I
have very little to say, so go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I agree. I really appreciate that Jane is a plain character who does not like magically become beautiful because somebody likes her. And I think this book does challenge some of those like Victorian ideas of like the beauty of your soul is like reflected in your outward appearance. Because as we've discussed, Jane is an incredibly good person, but she's not pretty. And she's not, just because she's plain, it doesn't mean that her personality is less interesting or less rich, which I really like. I feel like this book, one of the things I did really like about it is that it kind of shows like plain people are deserving of love and joy. As I loathe Rochester with every cell in my body, the fact that she does get a romantic happy ending, I think is pretty cool, like in the context of the book and when it was written especially.
Yeah.
Strongly agree on that. I think Jane herself said it best when she said, "Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, I'm soulless and heartless?" Like, what? How can we top that?
Yeah.
Her mind.
Yep. Okay. We're gonna bounce back over to characters for a minute, and kind of plot, I guess, too. So that like weird interval in the middle where because like I had never read Jane Eyre. I was not interested in like watching any of the movie versions or anything. So I had no idea that there's like this whole chunk of the book where she's like, all right, bye, I'm leaving. I'm going to go starve in a hedgerow. And then she's like rescued by her cousins, like thankfully. So yeah, like if we have like thoughts on that part of the book, because I actually really enjoyed quite a few of the scenes there. I like honestly just seeing her and Diana and Mary hang out and be like girlfriends was like my favorite thing. I was like, Jane needs this. She has earned this. So yeah, like if we have any thoughts on them, we're also, I know that we're supposed to say Sinjin, but I can't make myself. Like I'm sorry. I'm probably gonna keep calling him Saint John because for whatever reason, Sinjin makes me think of like Sinbad the Sailor or something.
So exciting.
Really though,
So,
like, if you pronounce Sinjin, I want to know the historical reasoning for that because I don't get it.
yeah.
Do with like the accent or something, maybe like the way they would pronounce Saint John. But
I'm sure it does, but I just don't understand how you get rid of that many letters.
It really shook me to my core when I read his name physically for the first time after having only listened to the audiobook, and I was like, wait, what? It's not like Sinjin? Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, so both pronunciations are accepted here. Even though one of them is probably objectively wrong, which is the one that I've been using.
but we'll call him that regardless.
yeah.
Yes. So thoughts on those characters in that part of the book?
Slim Jim, sorry. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, Jess said she called him Slim Jim in her head while she read the book. We also accept that pronunciation.
Oh my god.
So Slim
That's
Jim.
my favorite. Slim Jim.
I also really enjoyed that part of the book. It was nice for Jane to be among, for the most part, healthier relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And other than her relationship with Helen Burns and her relationship with Adele, I feel like this is like one of the only like grown adult relationships she has where it's not romantic and there's really not much in the way. They just really love her, and that was fun. And as much as I have this time around, I feel like I really didn't like Sinjin. Before I was just like, I get his point. But this time around, he really got on my nerves because he's kind of annoying and boring. And like the fact that he isn't as amusing as Rochester really just, but I really have always been into the sort of romance that didn't happen between him and what's her name? I forget her name.
I know. I was very invested in that subplot.
It was so short. I think it might have been 2 scenes where they were together and one where he was talking about it with Jane, where he literally put aside 15 minutes to like talk about their like the life together that he would like to have. And then he was like, okay, that's enough joy.
Yeah. Right.
I want to find it. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. I also like
Miss Oliver.
What's that? Sorry, Julia.
Miss Oliver is her name.
Miss Oliver.
Was that her? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was also like weirdly invested in their doomed love. And I think like St. John or Sinjin, I think like he provided, I think, a really interesting character like theme to explore because like he's kind of presented, I feel like he kind of shows like the difference between doing good and doing good with compassion, because he's not a compassionate person really. Like he always does the right thing, but it's like his heart almost has nothing to do with it, if that makes sense. So I was very conflicted on how I felt about him because I actually found him a much better developed character than Rochester. But then like near the end when he started like pushing Jane around like Rochester was, I was like, oh, you're trash too. Like just
really
trash men as far as the eye can see. So yeah, but I do think he added a lot to the book in the sense of like the things that his character made me think about. Yeah, but like I mean, like I said, I just like really loved seeing Diana and Mary and Jane just like hang out and have girl time. That was my favorite thing.
And like one of them was I always get the two cousins mixed up, but one of them teaching Jane German before St. John forced her to quit. But like I thought that was cute. And I think once he mentioned like Jane laying her head on one of their laps by the fire. So charming.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a really sweet part. It's not my favorite part of the book.
Yeah, it was also like,
but it's nice to see Jane get appreciated, and they're like, "Oh, you can draw us. Will you teach us how to draw?" Like, it's just nice because Jane's been just pooped on her whole life, and now there's some people who are like, "We like you."
Yeah, I know. It was very like rewarding to finally see Jane like get some attention and like relationships that like made her happy. It was also nice to like another thing about her and Rochester is like he's literally the first eligible man she has met in her life. And I'm like, maybe you should, I don't know, like meet other humans before you declare your undying love for him. So in that sense, I guess like the fact that she spent time away from him and she met St. John, I guess in a way that kind of like strengthened slightly my belief that she actually cared about Rochester. Because like the whole time they were interacting, I'm like, he's your boss and you've literally never met another man since you've been a grown woman. Like this is, you have options, Jane. Don't settle.
And it's weird because at the end she has her own means to go on, so like she doesn't have to settle, but she's still like, no, I'm still into that.
That was really, I know, like I get the whole point in terms of like themes and literature, but part of me is like, girl, this man has nothing.
Yeah. Like, and also the fact that Rochester literally had to be set on fire to become a nicer person, I'm like, buddy, like I don't buy your character arc. Like that's part of what it comes down to for me. Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like I keep circling back to like, and another thing that I hate about him.
There's a lot to talk about.
I'm very sorry. What's that, Taylor?
Sorry, I was just saying there's a lot to talk about. It's a long book, so.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So much to
so, okay. What's that, Julia?
And there's so much to hate about Rochester, so it just keeps coming up.
There really is. Yeah, I actually wrote a Goodreads review for this book, and like when I was listing things I hated about Rochester, it was just like off the top of my head, and I eventually had to cut it off because I'm like, we got to move on. Like there's more. Okay, so we've talked about a couple of the themes already, and I have a couple other things about that. So how do we feel like this book handled class, like classism in this period in Britain? Do we feel like the book and Jane's story like subverted that or played into that or any combination thereof?
It's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I do like is that Jane is not swayed by wealth. And I feel like a lot of books treat wealth or the possession of wealth as like a reward for characters, for them being good and pure and so on. And Jane is a very good person, and at the end she is rewarded with a large inheritance, and she chooses to take just a small portion of that and split it with her loved ones. And I think it's really interesting that she chooses, I mean, she doesn't choose to be poor, but she chooses to be poorer than she would have been if she had just taken the entire inheritance. And at the end, I do like that financially she and Rochester are on similar grounds. And I also like that they're not outrageously wealthy. I thought that was a very good decision. And the fact that Jane just is not motivated by wealth is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, excuse me, too, that like Jane and Slim Jim are kind of wild in that way because like he's like, I'm doing good. I'm supposed to do good. Da da da. And Jane is like she doesn't claim to be a good person, but she is. You know, like at the beginning, she's like, yeah, I'll probably go to hell. Ooh, I better not die. Like another iconic moment, may I just say. But when it comes down to it, like the way her personality is, she's like, oh, well, why would I need this insane amount of money when I can share it with people who I care about, who are my family? Like, that's a good person thing to do.
Yeah.
But circling back to class, yeah, I mean, obviously we see it throughout the whole story with her kind of being like this second class citizen in her own home that she's growing up in because she's not the child of her aunt and uncle. And then, you know, when Rochester has like all the party guests over, it's like a very clear divide of like, these are the people who are socializing and playing games, and Jane's like hiding behind a curtain with her book, and she's like, I was asked to be here, but it feels like I should not be here. But then we do get the subversion of it at the end with her rising above her station, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I quite enjoyed the scenes with the like rude rich people. I feel like they like made the story start like happening. Like I actually like I really liked Charlotte Bronte's dialogue, and I wish there had been more of that. And less of like, I don't know, rambling descriptions with like 17 semicolons in one sentence. But yeah, so I also like, I think that there is a very strong element of like class, and specifically where Jane is in the hierarchy, because she's working class essentially at this point. I mean, it's like a gentlewoman's working class, but like she is having to work for her living. And I also think it's interesting, like the book kind of, in my opinion, the book kind of subverts this like hyper focus on class a little bit, because Jane does end up like rising above her station. I mean, she marries her employer, like who owns this like fancy estate before it burns down. So in that sense, it is So in that sense, it is very like it is very like plays against that idea. But I also noticed that there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that Jane is in this position because of circumstances, like that she actually is like well born. Like there's a scene when she's like sick at her cousin's house before she knows they're her cousins, and everyone's kind of like talking over her as she's like half asleep, and they're talking about how she has like nobility in her face, and like you can tell that she's not really a poor person, that she just like is down on her luck. She doesn't, you know, like you can tell just like from her features that she's like actually like above like the beggars at the door. Like she's not really one of them. So that was something that I noticed a lot throughout the book, is like this tension between like, yeah, we're like class is not as important, but you also should still be born in class. Like I guess money is not as important. Like that part of classism, I feel like was dealt with in a really kind of like modern way. Like Jane getting her independence and like sharing that with people, and that kind of putting her on an equal footing with Rochester. But I do think there were still some elements of that Victorian sensibility of like, okay, but are you poor and like a gentlewoman, or poor and like you were born to working class parents, you know?
Right. Yeah. You're poor, but were your parents poor? Like, difference.
Yeah. Exactly.
See like nobility on someone's face. Like, what does that mean? Like gilded cheekbones or something?
Yeah. I know, like it was like in such vague terms too. Like they didn't mention any specific feature. They were like, you know, she just has those like rich people vibes in her bone structure. Like,
Are you calling rich people ugly? Because Jane says throughout the whole novel how plain she is. So I'm just asking.
That's right. And Rochester's real ugly too. Okay, I'm sorry I haven't been keeping up with comments very well. Let's see. Yes. So Novelytic said if her aunt hadn't deferred Jane's other uncle or cousin, like that letter, if she hadn't kept that regarding her inheritance and lied about her, things would be so different. And yeah, I either had forgotten about that part or never got to that part when I tried to read the book. But I was so mad on Jane's behalf. I was like outraged for her. Yeah, like the fact, like just knowing that she could have been with people who loved her whole life was bleak. Okay, so still kind of on the subject of themes and a little bit on characters. So let's talk about Bertha. Bertha Mason, Rochester's madwoman in the attic. So this is going to be kind of like a broad category because there's a lot to, as English teachers love to say, there's a lot to unpack here. So how do we feel about the way this book dealt with Bertha's character, the theme of madness and what that meant, and also there like some of the like racial implications or subtext, because I believe it says she's from, is it the West Indies where Rochester had property? Like, so it's kind of vague, but yeah, so that's another thing that plays into this. So any thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, Bertha is one of those characters that I feel like the more I read this book, the more I keep saying, yikes. Just as a standpoint, not a standpoint, but just, I guess, this is the first time where I actually registered that she was half Creole. Like, they mentioned that she's half Creole. And that's when I started hearing, like, they referred to her hair as shaggy. And this is the first time where I actually, like, noticed that her mom, who was full-blooded Creole, is also insane, and that is also incredibly interesting. But I do also find it fascinating that the madness is passed down through the female bloodline.
Oh, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. And I remember once again copying from Mrs. Brown's 12th grade class. The madness is supposed to be some symbolic of like female subjugation, and also I guess Jane Eyre's own passion that she's keeping locked up. That's all I can provide right now. It's been a long time since I've taken that class.
Yeah, and we have that whole conversation where Rochester is finally telling Jane that he's, married. Whoops. And Jane says to him, she's like, well, why, like, how can I marry you knowing this? Like, for one thing, it's wrong because you're, like, legally we can't get married, but also, like, she's like, if I were to go mad, are you going to lock me in the attic? Yeah. Like, and he's like, no, I don't hate her because she's mad. Like, I hate her for all these other reasons. And they struck me as very hypocritical. I mean, they're kind of vague about exactly what Bertha was doing, but they're like referring to like her vices and like these like inappropriate tastes and all of this, and like kind of alluding to like she might have been like promiscuous or something. So what do you expect? And I'm reading that part and I'm like, sorry, Rochester, did you forget about the fact where like a few hundred pages ago you were telling Jane about the like 4 European mistresses you had when you were trying to find yourself? Like, it felt very like typical of the way that we talk about men who do those things versus women. And I feel like Taylor, kind of like you were saying, like this idea of madness and what it represents, I feel like a lot of the way they're talking about Bertha's, it was like a punishment for her, like, I don't know, her like sexual history and whatever else she was doing. Like, I don't know if it was like gambling or other things that weren't considered like ladylike or appropriate, but yeah, I noticed like it felt very hypocritical of Rochester to be like, well, I hated her because she was a bad person, and you knew this because she did all the things that I did.
Yeah, the person who's teaching your possible love child, like,
yeah. His lack of self-awareness is wild.
It's really funny.
Yeah, truly, the double standards are abound, and it makes me think too. I was watching a movie with my roommate last night, and there's like a plot point where someone's like, she's lying, you can't believe her, and it's like, well, if someone thinks you're lying, like no matter what, you you could tell them the truth all you want, they're going to say you're lying. It's like that same thing with Bertha, with them being like, look how crazy she is. She's setting fires. She's stabbing people. It's like, she's been locked in this attic. I would be acting like that too. Like, I would come at you and bite you. Like, so it's just, yeah. It's hard to determine because you can't really get a real read on who she was as a person before all you get is Rochester and what he's saying of what she was like. Well, I don't know how much I can, believe what you're saying, buddy.
And if Bertha and her family did have some history of mental illness or whatever it would have been, like the ways they treated that in this era are like, well, if you weren't insane before, you're probably going to be after this because, like you said, she's locked up. She's treated like a monster. I also noticed how careful they were to let us know that she has now gotten ugly and fat, and that's part of her hideousness, or part of what makes her a scary mad woman is she's not even a pretty crazy person. Which I thought was very odd. And then we have another comment. What I find terrifying is that in that era, men were allowed to lock their wife up for being crazy, and it was not taboo. Yes, and also the fact that when everyone found out about this, they're like, "Oh, Rochester's such a good guy. He didn't just abandon her to an asylum. He kept her." And it's I know asylums would have been even worse, but it's very odd that everyone responds to you locked up a person with, wow, you're taking such good care of her.
Bare minimum.
Yeah. So any other thoughts on that? I feel like there's a lot to talk about with the way Bertha's character is handled. I just feel so bad for her.
Yeah. I know there's some book out there, and I can't remember who wrote it, and it's supposed to be from the a backstory for Bertha.
Yes. Yeah. I think it is White Sargasso Sea.
Yeah.
Yeah. I probably won't read it because I read a book by that author and it wasn't my favorite, but the concept is really interesting, and I would like to know more about Bertha's backstory because I also have to think she was taken from the Caribbean to England, which is already super different and far away, and I'm assuming she's meant to look at least part black because they mention her hair and so on. So, no one looks like her, at least in her area. And I would be a little bit miffed too. Also, your husband hates you, so there's that.
Yeah. I know she's kind of. I feel like a lot of times in the book she serves as a plot device, which I know that the period this was written, and it's not we're going to get this really compassionate backstory for her, or that would be very unlikely. But just the fact that she's only there as the scary thing in the attic instead of actually Jane, to her credit, seems to be much more upset about what happened to her than everyone else. And I also think the fact that Bertha's purpose kind of ultimately is to burn down the house and die so that Rochester and Jane can end up together. That's at least it's hard for me not to see the ending as well, that was very fortunate for you two.
And this is not a parallel that I intended to make, but I was just glancing down at the quotes I had saved on my phone, and it's interesting that Bertha is this stifled, hidden away character who's the mad woman, but literally Jane says in terms of hiding her feelings away about Rochester, it is a madness in all women to let a secret love kindle within them, which if unreturned and unknown must devour the life that feeds it. So I'm obviously talking about something very different and meaning madness much more metaphorically, but it's just interesting that she's if you're hiding some of you away, it eats away at you and drives you crazy, and that's probably what happened to Bertha in a sense.
Yeah, and I also had just read The Yellow Wallpaper for the first time earlier in the month, so it was I don't even know if I thought about this while I was reading it, but in hindsight I'm yeah, you're kind of making Bertha into what you already thought she was. Like if she wasn't, like, my God, the ways they would treat mental illness or like hysterics or whatever they called it when women were unhappy, like the things that they would do to them, I'm like, you are creating the problem if they don't already have it. Yeah, the subplot with Bertha definitely does not age well. And I also think it's interesting, which I think we talked a little bit about this before the live show, but the fact that she is half Creole, like they kind of use like code words for like her family history, or like they don't even like explicitly tell you what she looked like, except like Taylor, like you were saying, like kind of the racially coded descriptions of her hair. And it's kind of like, I think if you weren't looking for it, you might not notice. Like I had not gotten to that part the first time I read this book, and I did not know that Bertha was a person of color. So I don't know. Do you guys remember if they cast her like that in any of the movies? Because I also haven't seen those, so I wouldn't know.
I've only seen the one with Michael Fassbender, and I don't think they did.
No, she had like dark hair, I remember, but she looked quite fair from what I remember.
Yeah. I wonder if part of it is I feel like maybe a lot of filmmakers might not know how to tackle the racial element of it, because it's a very slippery slope. On one hand, you can create maybe a sort of sympathy for Bertha and how women and maybe women of color were treated, and also draw a parallel to colonialism, which there's actually a lot of that happening in this book behind the scenes too.
Yes.
Jane's uncle in Madeira, St. John going on a missionary trip, and then Rochester's going to the Caribbean and bringing back someone.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a lot of that there. Like, I don't think it's explicit, but it's something that I noticed a lot more this time around. Yeah, I just don't know if I think a director would really struggle with how to portray Bertha as a woman of color and make it both sympathetic, but also hold true to the point of the book.
Yeah. Right. Because there's not really a lot of, like, if they were trying to adapt pretty honestly from the book, there's not really a lot of scenes she's in, like, just period. And there's definitely not a lot where she's like a more active part of them, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're right, Taylor, and they were kind of just like, well, we don't want to do it badly, so maybe we just won't do it. Yeah. And I want to go off of something you said. You mentioned like the kind of overall themes of colonialism in this book. Do we have any other thoughts on that? Because that was something too that I picked up on, and especially like the way, I mean, it's making me realize like so many of these classics where they're like, oh yeah, we have property in the Caribbean. I'm like, oh, like that's what you're talking about. Like you're possibly a slave owner, or at the very least, like you have your resources are because of that. So is there any other thoughts that we had about that? It is kind of like we were saying about some of the other things, it is kind of like couched in language that makes it kind of hard to tell what is going on. But if we did have any other thoughts on that.
It's pretty like beneath the surface, and I personally don't know if Charlotte Bronte was trying to make a point. I think it was more like, this is what's going on today. We've got missionaries in India, we've got plantations in the Caribbean, we've got attic wives from the Caribbean. It's just a normal day.
Yeah.
So I don't know if she was personally trying to say anything about it, but it is something interesting that I found while rereading this book.
Mm-hmm.
How ingrained it was.
Yeah. I kind of got a similar feeling where it was like she was like, this is just how life is. It's like, if you're wealthy, you have land in the Caribbean, and like if you're somebody who is like believing that they are, I don't know, like destined to do something, and you're like in the church, you're probably going to go on a missionary trip to a like underdeveloped country, you know? Yeah, I also kind of got the feeling that it was very like matter of fact. Like she almost didn't feel a need to explain it or put it in context, because like all of her readers would have known what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how you guys described that as it being like very matter of fact, and I agree. I had read way back in like February a nonfiction book that was about like a couple different like well-known female authors and like their friendships with other women. And the section about Charlotte Bronte, I can't remember her friend's name for the life of me, but she had a friend who literally would always read her books and be like, make them more political. Like, you should be talking about this. And I wondered if her friend was like reading this and being like, you're almost there, Charlotte. Like, talk about it more.
That sounds like a great book. I love the idea of her having a friend who's like, but what if you went harder?
Yeah. I'll find
That's
the name
super
of
interesting.
it was a good read. I'll find the name of the book for you guys.
Okay, while you look for that, do we want to share, like, I think we kind of covered most of the topics that I had down here. We can obviously, like, if you guys have any more thoughts on those, we can go back, or other things you wanted to talk about. But I thought we should also share favorite quotes now, as we're kind of like wrapping up. I'm sorry, we kind of went over time, which I honestly expected, because there is a lot, a lot in this book.
Our last live was like an hour and a half. You're good.
We always have so many feelings.
So, like, if we have favorite like quotes or scenes, we can go ahead and share those now, and then maybe like kind of finish off with any like final thoughts or another topic we want to talk about. I'm so proud of myself. I actually have my quote ready this time for once in my life, and it is very basic, but I love it anyway, and I'm gonna share it. And I think, Julia, you might have actually alluded to this part already, but it's when she's like telling off Rochester, and she says, "Do you think I am an automaton, a machine without feelings, and can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips and my drop of living water dashed from my cup? Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, or even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if we both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet, equal as we are." Just like that whole speech, I'm like, what a queen. I love her.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I read a very long one because I was like, I can't cut any of this. I love it.
It's good.
Mine is also long, so you're good. So I have women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for the faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more than learn than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Like, as much as I'm not a fan of like embroidery is hard work, but obviously you feel obligated to do embroidery or anything. But I thought that was a very interesting quote.
Yeah, I liked that one as well.
Yes, I am in total agreement. You both have alluded to some of the quotes that I jotted down. Like, I have bits and pieces of both of those parts. Obviously, the "I am no bird and no net snares me" is iconic. My favorite scene, I don't have like the actual quotes written down. My favorite scene, as I said, is Jane telling off the guy from Lowood School at the beginning when he comes to her aunt's house. That is my favorite moment every time. I just love how matter of fact she is when he's like, do you know what hell is? And she's like, a burning pit of fire. And he's like, okay, well, do you want to be in a burning pit of fire? No. So what must you do? Stay in good health and never die.
Yeah.
I love her. Yeah, I don't think I have really. Taylor, this might be, did you read this, or is this I think is like on the same page or somewhere really near what you just read. It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. I really like that. Even as a
Yeah.
homebody, I was like, for some reason, this speaks to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was something also impressive to me because like I'm also like introvert, homebody, don't want to go places, and like I often find it very hard to relate to characters where it's like I just want to see the world and do everything and never have a home anywhere. I like cannot relate. But yeah, but I was really impressed with how like easy it was for me to like get where Jane was coming from. I was like, yeah, of course you want to like experience more things and like just change something because you can change it and like all of that. I think yeah, just another reason I love Jane and I wish she were in a better book or had like a better love interest in my opinion.
That is so fair.
I also found the book that I was telling you guys about. It's called A Secret Sisterhood, The Literary Friendships of Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Virginia Woolf.
Ooh.
Okay.
Adding that to my list now.
It's a good read.
What's the first part? What was the first part of the title?
A Secret Sisterhood.
Secret Sisterhood. Okay. Yeah, definitely gonna check that out.
Yeah. I found it got better, like because chronologically, like we know the least about Jane Austen because her family like destroyed all her letters and stuff, and it's like, oh, thanks. So I found that like the farther it went on, the more interesting it was to me. But it was still a really nice read, you know, women being friends with women and supporting each other. We love it.
We do. The fact that my favorite scenes were when she was just hanging out with with her cousins was like pretty indicative of that. Okay. So do we have any like final thoughts on the book? If we have like another topic that you guys like really want to discuss, we can do that. Or also maybe just end with like kind of circling back to overall thoughts, like summing up how we feel about the book.
I think we covered everything I wanted to talk about. I'll just say that I love this book. I get why it might not be for everyone, but it is a circus of a book, and I love it.
I'll say again how much I love Jane Eyre as a character, and that's right, here comes the plug. Everyone who likes Jane Eyre should read Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay. Or also, My Plain Jane is a good time too. Not as close to my heart as Jane Steele, but again, kind of like a gratifying retelling.
Yeah, I'm excited to read My Plain Jane. I actually DNF'd Jane Steele too.
No,
I know. I'm sorry, Julie. I also think it's like really interesting, like what I have been seeing from people, and so far I feel like this is proven true for us, is like some people love both, but for the majority of readers, you're a Jane Eyre person or a Wuthering Heights person, and that is definitely true of me and my sister too, because my sister loves Jane Eyre and cannot stand Wuthering Heights, and I'm kind of the opposite. I mean, I liked Wuthering Heights less this reread than before, but it's one of those books where like, again, we were talking about this earlier, but I'm like, anytime somebody talks about like all these reasons why they don't like it, I'm like, you are correct. Like I have no defense for myself. I like it against my better judgment. Yeah, but I do think it's interesting, and this is kind of falling into the trap of comparing them, which I was going to try not to do maybe, but I do think it's really interesting that a lot of the criticisms, the valid criticisms people have of Wuthering Heights, are things that I think can be said for Jane Eyre, rightfully, and like I never hear people say that. Like lots of unlikable characters, arguably a pretty unhealthy romantic relationship, super depressing, which I like never hear people say about Jane Eyre, but I think it's incredibly depressing. And yeah, just I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of like vibe elements that they have in common, but for some reason Jane Eyre gets loved for them and Wuthering Heights gets hated, and that just, I don't think that's fair.
Well, I'll say this too. The reason I got up is to remind everyone that next month,
Yes.
or this month rather, because it's November, we're going to read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
So excited.
Broadway.
I'm really excited about this one. And so keep an eye on our Twitter account, which I should also link that in the description. I'll do that for the date that we're going to announce. But yeah, that's going to be on Julia's channel. We're very excited. I don't think any of us have read that one before.
I was going to say, it's the first time for all of us.
Yeah, which is going to be really exciting. And especially because I think, Julia, you mentioned during our Wuthering Heights live show, I think you said that like it's considered to be like one of the first feminist novels.
That's what Wikipedia told me.
Yeah, so I'm stoked for that.
Me too. I'm so excited.
Yeah. And Anne, I think, was my favorite of the three in their poetry that I read. So I have high hopes for her novel.
Yeah. I actually, now that you mention it, I might have read a couple of her poems. I don't remember for sure, but yeah, very, very much looking forward to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. So yeah, do we have like any final thoughts or like last minute things you thought of that you want to say about Jane Eyre or anything like that?
I have a question.
Yes.
Tell me your favorite or least favorite Rochester nickname for Jane. Because my least favorite nickname is Janet. I hate when he calls her Janet. That's not her name, my guy.
I hate that. Yeah. I think. Yeah. One that I did like is like some of when he was kind of like flirting with her by comparing her to a forest sprite. Yeah. I liked that. That appealed much more to my sensibilities than the normal way that he addressed her, which was like, I'm gonna keep you because you're gonna make me a better person with your goodness and virtue. And then he like threatened her when she said she wasn't gonna marry him, he's like, then I'm gonna become a bad person and it'll be your fault. And I'm like, go fuck yourself. Okay. He makes me so mad. I'm sorry, guys.
That's how you really feel, Kara.
I know. But yeah, I did like the fairy parts, and I agree on Janet. It made my skin crawl, and I'm like, it's not even a nickname; it's a different name.
Her name longer. That's not a nickname.
I agree with both of you. Janet, I used to read it as Janeite. I was like, what does that mean? Janet is also weird, but I do kind of like the little sprite and pixie thing, especially since she's so tiny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is it? Wait, now my brain is working overtime, and maybe Janet is supposed to be like Jeanette, like a diminutive version of Jane, in which case it makes more sense to me, but they should spell it with TTE.
They pronounce it as Janet in the audiobook that I listened to.
You're correct about that, though. Okay, well,
I just realized we did not talk about Adele at all.
She gets the short end of the stick. She's here. She's irrelevant. Okay.
I know. She's like I actually looked up all of what her French sayings meant because clearly they were not going to translate that for us. Charlotte Bronte's like, you guys can figure it out. But yeah, she was like pretty irrelevant to the story considering she's the reason that Jane shows up there. And that part where like she's like, I want my present, and then like her present finally gets there, and Rochester's like, now she's gonna want to like tell me she's excited, and she's gonna want to show me the things I got her, like an idiot. He's like, Mrs. Fairfax, get in here, let her be obnoxious to you, so I can hit on my governess over here. Like, he would not stop bitching about Adele, and I'm like, this. Like, your choices have consequences, sir. Like,
yeah. Also, you have to take her in. Like, it was the right thing to do, but technically he doesn't know if he's the father. So,
yeah.
Like, to yourself, my dude.
Yeah. And, like, when she dresses up, like, in her costume, and she's, like, curtsying and reciting, and he's like, yep, she's gonna be a really pretty slut like her mother. And I'm like...
like, whoa. Yeah. I do like Adele a lot. I think she's very cute and very endearing. There's this line at the end, though, that's a little, like, okay, where they said, like, Jane sent her to a school, and as she grew older, that horrible Frenchness about her, like, bled away.
Yes, like that her unfortunate French habits were like wrung out of her by the good English education, and I'm like, wow.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's like when we were talking about Heathcliff last live show, and we were like how ambiguous his background is, and it's like for the Victorian othering, it's like you really only had to be from like a different part of England for them to be like, whoa, like much less like the continent, like where those poorly behaved French people were. Yeah.
Mary Margaret
Wild.
gave a book recommendation, and so I went to add it on Goodreads, and it's already on my TBR. I'm so happy.
Love it.
I should share that. So yeah, Mary Margaret just shared, P.S. If you like this plot but want an update, 9 Coaches Waiting is a great story that's similar to Jane Eyre but without the toxic elements. I also already have that on my TBR from a previous recommendations video you did, so thank you, Mary Margaret. I'm excited. I'm actually like really looking forward to reading My Plain Jane now that I've actually like read the original novel, because I was just gonna go into it not knowing anything. Like, yeah, well, because I thought, I was like, I know the story, like most of it, and I read the first half, and I have no intention of reading the whole thing, so I'm gonna have fun and read this anyway. But I'm guessing I'll probably get more out of it now that I've actually read the novel. Okay, so I think we're finally gonna wrap it up. I keep getting distracted with other things that I wanted to talk about, even though like I've been talking for like an hour and a half. Okay, so thank you guys so much for joining us for our discussion of Jane Eyre. I had a great time discussing it, despite my very strong feelings. And thank you so much, Julia and Taylor, for co-hosting with me. Another reminder that our next book is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, and that is going to be hosted by Julia over on her channel. Be sure to check out my lovely co-hosts in the description. Again, there's voting links down below. Yeah, thank you for like hanging out and discussing this like I don't know, like this wild ride of a classic novel. Yeah, thank you guys. Anything to add, Taylor or Julia?
Thank you for hosting, Kara.
Yes.
Thank you for being patient with my complaining. And we all agree that Jane is a treasure, so that's the most important thing, honestly. Mm-hmm. This is like when we were discussing Mansfield Park. Like, we all loved Fanny.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will see you guys sometime at the end of the month.
Bye.
Bye.